So when you looked at the headlines in 2025, it was a lot. You had this brutal conflict in Sudan, right? Then this huge global trade shock seemingly out of nowhere, and on top of all that, prices just kept going up. Now, on the surface, those look like three totally separate things, but what if they're not? What if they're all connected? We're going to pull on those threads and see just how tangled this whole thing really is.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll set the scene, the world really feeling the pressure. Then we'll dive into our three big stories, the crisis in Fasher, that global tariff shock, and what rising inflation actually feels like. And then we'll connect all the dots.
2025 has just felt intense, like the whole world is under this incredible strain. It feels like we're just bouncing from one crisis to the next, right? From these awful humanitarian situations to major economic shakeups. But you have to wonder, is this all just random bad luck, or is there something else going on? A pattern, maybe?
So that's the central question, right? That's the puzzle we're here to solve. How on earth can a horrible war in North Darfur have anything to do with a bunch of new U.S. trade tariffs, which then somehow connect to the price of your groceries in, say, Saudi Arabia? It seems impossible. But to find the answer, we've got to start with the human cost.
Okay, so our first piece of this puzzle takes us to Fasher. It's the capital of North Darfur in Sudan. And for months, it felt like the whole world was just holding its breath, watching this catastrophe just building on the horizon. And then it hit. And what unfolded there? It's just a story of unimaginable suffering.
I mean, just let that sink in. That's a direct testimony given to the UN Human Rights Council. It paints this absolutely brutal picture of what happened when that paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, you'll see them called the RSF, took over the city. It wasn't just a takeover. They unleashed a complete wave of terror.
And when you actually look at the UN's official documentation, you see this chilling pattern emerge. This wasn't just the chaos of war. No, this was systematic. We're talking about targeted, ethnically motivated killings. The widespread use of rape as a deliberate weapon. They attacked hospitals, medical staff. They forced over 800,000 people from just one camp to flee. This was a calculated campaign of horror.
And this right here, this quote from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, it gets right to the absolute core of it. Foreseen and preventable. The world knew this was coming. I mean, the UN itself issued more than 20 separate warnings and statements about it. Everyone saw it coming. And yet, nothing was done to stop it. The big question is, why? Let's hang on to that question for a minute, because we need to pivot to our second crisis.
All right, let's make a hard pivot now. We're going from this deeply humanitarian crisis to what looks like a massive economic one. And here's the crazy part. At the very same time Fasher was under siege, the world's largest economy, the US, was launching this incredibly dramatic total overhaul of its trade policy.
So to get our heads around this economic shock, we're looking at a report from the Congressional Research Service. Think of them as the nonpartisan, just-the-facts research team for the U.S. Congress. And this report, well, it details a whole series of brand new, sweeping tariffs that were rolled out in 2025. And these weren't small changes. They sent absolute shockwaves through the entire global economy.
And this table really gives you a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about. The U.S. used these really broad executive powers to hit pretty much all of its trading partners with new tariffs. We're talking a baseline of 10 to 41% on basically everything. Then you've got special tariffs just for China, and then, get this, a staggering 50% on steel and aluminum. This was not a minor adjustment. This was like taking a wrecking ball to the global trade system.
So you might be asking, how is this even possible? Well, a key piece of this puzzle is a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. And basically, it gives the U.S. president this huge power to regulate the economy as long as they declare a national emergency. And in 2025, national emergencies were declared for all sorts of things, trade deficits, the fentanyl supply chain, and that's what opened the door for these massive new tariffs.
Okay, let's pause and take stock. We've got a horrific humanitarian crisis in Sudan. We've got this massive economic shockwave coming from the U.S. Now let's look at the ripple effect. Let's see how these huge global forces have a very real, very local impact. And that brings us to our third and final piece of the puzzle.
This is where we really start to connect the dots. On one side, you have that U.S. policy report about tariffs. On the other, the Saudi Central Bank's inflation report from the exact same time. And trust me, there is a direct line connecting these two documents. Let's trace it.
And right there, inside that Saudi report, we find a huge clue. They list the key challenges facing the global economy. And what's on that list?
quote, trade policies uncertainty. That is not abstract economic theory. That is a major central bank pointing its finger directly at these new tariffs and calling them a source of major instability. And that uncertainty, it had a very real cost. And that cost is 2.3%. That's how much the inflation rate jumped in Saudi Arabia in just that one quarter of 2025. And look, that's not just a number on a chart. That's the cost of groceries going up. That's the pressure that families feel every single day.
And here it is. This is the smoking gun. The Saudi central bank, in its own inflation report, directly quotes the IMF. And what does it say? That inflation is expected to stay high. Specifically, quote, due to the impact of tariffs. There you have it. The line from U.S. trade policy to rising prices in Saudi Arabia is now crystal clear. It's undeniable.
Okay, so we've looked at our three pieces: a preventable atrocity in Sudan, a massive trade shock from the U.S., and the resulting inflation felt around the world. Now, let's finally put it all together and see the whole picture.
So here's how it all connects. Think about it like this. Global leadership, it only has so much attention it can give. There's a finite amount of bandwidth. And when the world's biggest powers are all consumed by an escalating trade war, when they're busy dealing with economic fallout and planning their next move, well, their attention, their political capital, it just gets stretched incredibly thin.
And that brings us right back to Fasher. Remember those haunting words from the UN High Commissioner, foreseen and preventable? Well, when the entire international community is distracted by an economic fire that, frankly, it started itself, its ability, and maybe even its willingness, to deal with the humanitarian crisis on the other side of the world just plummets. The diplomatic energy, the focus, it's just not there anymore.
And what you end up with is this vicious cycle. All this global instability, coming from the humanitarian crisis and the trade war. It doesn't just stay in the headlines or in the halls of power. No, it trickles down. It creates those very real economic pressures, like that 2.3% inflation jump that put a squeeze on regular households everywhere.
So when you boil it all down, the main takeaway is both simple and incredibly powerful. In our world today, there's just no such thing as a truly isolated event. A policy decision made in one country's capital can create the economic chaos that distracts the entire world from atrocities happening in another. And all that instability, combined, is what makes the price of food go up for a family in a third country. They are not separate stories. They are all one story.
Which leaves us with a really tough, really critical question. In a world that's this deeply connected, where a single economic decision can have devastating, life-or-death consequences for people thousands of miles away, what does good global leadership even look like anymore? How are we supposed to navigate this tangled-up, complicated world?